Welcome, salam, and thanks for tuning in to my second video. My last video was about the Semitic language family, and I mean Semitic languages are the main point of my channel. It's called Ancient Semitic for a reason, but I will also do some reading in Egyptian on this channel. For that reason, I found it maybe useful to talk about Afro-Asiatic languages as well. So the last video was on the Semitic language family, but I also mentioned that the Semitic language family belongs to a larger language family, or it's also called a phylum, and that is the Afro-Asiatic phylum. So in this video I will talk about the research history, how the Afro-Asiatic phylum or family was discovered in quotations, or how it was named. I will talk about some common features of Afro-Asiatic languages. I will talk about what languages actually do belong to this family, and yeah, I will give you, in the end, I will even give you a very few examples on Proto-Afro-Asiatic, so have fun. So some remarks on the research history of the Afro-Asiatic language family, which wasn't always known as Afro-Asiatic, but in the past it was called Hamido-Semitic. This name is now obsolete for several reasons. If you don't already know, you will see, I'll explain it. But yeah, what is the history of these Afro-Asiatic or Hamido-Semitic languages? How did linguists come to know about them? So in my last video on Semitic languages, I've already talked about scholars who knew different Semitic languages and noticed the similarities between them. And I've also already mentioned a name called Yehuda ben Quraysh, who was a Jewish grammarian living in North Africa. And being a Jewish grammarian, he knew Hebrew, Aramaic, and Arabic, but living in North Africa, he also knew Tamazight, which is, in today's terminology, a Berber language. Okay, so knowing these four languages, he noticed similarities between them, between Arabic, Aramaic, and Hebrew, but also between those three on the one hand and Tamazight on the other hand. So we can say that Yehuda bin Quraysh was maybe one of the earliest Afro-Asiatic linguists, even though, of course, that terminology didn't exist back then. So when did this language family become defined as such? We can now skip to the 19th century and talk about the Austrian scholar, I think mostly an ethnologist, Friedrich Müller, who coined the term Hamido-Semitic. So he published a book called Grundriss der Sprachwissenschaft, which means Outline of Linguistics, in which he categorized languages from around the world, and one of the language families proposed by him he called Hamido-Semitic. So the term Semitic already existed. I've talked about that in the last video, and so he came up with the idea to form a language family that contains Semitic on the one hand and a couple of languages on the other hand that are similar to Semitic but not similar enough to be considered Semitic. He called those languages Hamitic, which is just a parallel idea to why Semitic was called Semitic. So Shem and Ham were brothers, and well, according to the Old Testament, the Egyptians were descendants of Ham and also several other African peoples. So apparently inspired by the Old Testament, Müller had the idea to name these languages Hamitic because the languages we're talking about are all spoken in Africa. So yeah, what was Hamitic according to Friedrich Müller's book Grundriss der Sprachwissenschaft? He divided it into three groups, namely Egyptian, Libyan, and Ethiopian. So Egyptian is, well, that's what we still call Egyptian. Libyan is what we would call Berber today. And Ethiopian is what we would call Cushitic today. Do you notice something missing? Yes, if you know Afro-Asiatic languages, you notice that, well, first of all, Omotic is missing, but also, maybe even more important, Chadic is missing. Why didn't he include Chadic? Didn't he know Chadic? Yes, he certainly knew Hausa. He wrote a chapter on Hausa in his book, but he didn't see it as Hamitic for different reasons, and I will go a little more into detail. But first, let's take a more detailed look detailed look on the Hamitic languages according to Friedrich Müller. So first of all, a very simple family tree. You can see, let me use the laser pointer, you can see the Hamitic-Semitic language family here, and obviously it is subdivided into Hamitic on one hand and Semitic on the other hand. And the chapter on Hamito-Semitic is found in the part on the so-called, what he calls, languages of the curly-haired races in his book. So yeah, I'll give you a little more context. So he was a scholar from the 19th century, and of course European linguistics were still heavily influenced by racial theories in the 19th century. So he published basically 3 books on language families. One was Languages of the Curly-Haired Races, which in English terminology would be Caucasoid, okay, or Caucasian. And another volume was a language of the plain-haired races, which in other words would be Mongoloid, so like East Asian, etc., and Turkic languages, etc. And the other volume or part of his encyclopedia on languages was Languages of the Woolly-Haired Races, which in the terminology back then would also be called Negroid. Okay, so I will talk about this a little more in detail, and I just want to make clear that these racist-based linguistic theories of the 19th century do not reflect my own views or academic standpoints. I'm just quoting them here to teach you about the research history of the Hamito-Semitic language family. And luckily, thank God, and of course, these theories have been abandoned a long time ago. And yeah, but I will talk a little more about these racist theory and some of the darker aspects of 19th century linguistics. So first of all, just the subdivisions Hamito-Semitic in Friedrich Müller's book. So as I already said, Hamitic contained in his book 3 different branches, namely Egyptian, Libyan, which he also calls Tamashek, and Ethiopian. So Egyptian, he further subdivides into Old Egyptian, also calls it the language of the hieroglyphs, and Late Egyptian, which he also calls Coptic. So this term, Late Egyptian, has of course a different meaning than what we call Late Egyptian today. I will talk about Egyptian in detail in this video, and I will make even more detailed videos on Egyptian in the future, but today Egyptian is subdivided into Old, Middle, and Late Egyptian, and then Demotic and Coptic. So back then it was only divided in 2 historical stages, hieroglyphic and Coptic, basically. Okay, so Egyptian, first branch of his Hamitic, so-called Hamitic family. Second one, Libyan or Tamashek, which we will call Berber today. In his book, it is only a single language, and even today there is a debate whether Berber can be seen as a single language with different dialects, or as a group of closely related languages. And the third branch in Müller's book, which belongs to the Hamitic family, is Ethiopian. Like I said, we call that Cushitic today, which in his book contains Beja, or also Bishari. Today we call it Beja. Galla, which we today call Oromo. The term Galla is now rejected by the Oromo and is considered derogatory, so we don't use that anymore. Then Somali, Dankali, which is now called Afar, Saho, Bilin, to which he adds language of the Bogos, and Khamir, to which he adds language of the Agaw. Khamir today is also known as Khamtanga. I will mention them again when I talk about the Cushitic languages in more detail. So this is the entirety of the Hamitic language family according to Müller. Semitic, he lists 5, maybe I could translate it as stock languages: Old Arabian, Assyrian, Ethiopic or Ge'ez, Aramaic, and Hebrew. So Old Arabian is basically his terminology for classical Arabic, and Assyrian, he means Akkadian. And he says there are also modern languages, especially in the Ethiopic branch like Amharic, Tigrinya, he mentions them, but he only treats these 5 languages in more detail. He deems those 5 the most archaic ones or most basic Semitic languages. So this is his, so Friedrich Müller's classification of what he called Hamitic-Semitic, which we don't call it anymore today. So yeah, but where's Chadic? Let's find out. So, like I already said, linguistics back then was heavily influenced by racist theories and by the theory of the 3 human races, as in Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid, and this was also reflected in Müller's classification of languages. So he mentions Hausa in his books, but Hausa is mentioned in the volume on languages of the woolly-haired races, which means in 19th century terminology, the Negroid race. That is further divided into several subraces, and according to Müller, Hausa is a, and excuse me if I use this word, but that is his terminology, as a Negro language. So in his original German, in the original German book, it is eine Negersprache, okay, a Negro language. And interestingly, there's a whole chapter on Hamitic features of Hausa. So what he does, he acknowledges the fact that he acknowledges the fact that there's a lot of Hamitic features in Hausa, and he lists them and compares them to like Cushitic languages, Berber, Egyptian, etc. But still, he doesn't classify Hausa as a Hamitic language because of the racial background of his classification, and because the Hausa are, well, they're, let's say, because of their phenotype, they are, in quotes, Negroes to him. He probably couldn't imagine that their language is anything else, that their language is actually what he would call Hamitic. Okay, so just to summarize, the so-called Chadic languages, the term didn't exist back then, but Hausa and the similar languages that were similar to Hausa, were not seen as part of Hamitic due to race, the concept of race that defined science back then. Okay, yeah, so he thought it was just influenced by Hamitic since ancient times, hence the similarities. Just one more word on the term Hamitic. The term Hamitic was later expanded massively on non-linguistic grounds, which means on grounds of racial theory. And so, for example, European scholars divided peoples in Africa back then in the 19th century into Hamitic and Negroid. At some point, not based on language, but based on behavior, culture, and they saw Hamitic peoples as dominant and Negroid peoples as submissive. And so often, if there was a certain region where one people dominated another, the dominating people was simply classified as Hamitic on non-linguistic grounds. And this, of course, led to a lot of discrimination. It even led to genocide. So luckily, this Hamitic race theory, how it is called, is dropped today. It does not play any role in historic linguistics today. And yeah, but this was what it was back then, so just to give an overview. But what did become of this so-called Hamito-Semitic language family? Let's see how research went on after that. So, in the 1950s, the linguist Joseph Greenberg came up with, in this context, basically 2 things. First, a new subclassification of the so-called Hamito-Semitic languages, and secondly, a new name. So, first of all, he renamed them, calling them Afro-Asiatic. And why was Hamito-Semitic dropped? I think it was maybe partially due to how due to the negative connotation of the term Hamitic, but also because, according to Greenberg, the classification of Hamitic languages did not make any sense on linguistic grounds, because languages like Egyptian, Berber, and Cushitic were not more similar to each other than they were to Semitic, so it didn't make sense to come up with that sub-branch of this language family and excluding Semitic. So he came up with a more neutral classification, and he also added Chadic. Chadic was now accepted as a branch of this language family. So in Greenberg's model, Afro-Asiatic, what it was called then, and is still called now, besides Afrasian, was classified into Semitic, Egyptian, Berber, Chadic, and Cushitic. And you see also the terminology was updated, so Libyan was renamed Berber, and Cushitic and Ethiopian was renamed Cushitic. Interestingly, just to come back to that racial aspect of this theory, there were theories that were in part spread by African scholars in the mid-20th century that somehow try to also apply racism to historical linguistics, but somehow try to, let's say, return the favor, because there were some African linguists who were trying to promote an Afrocentric view on African languages and promote a unity as African languages, so saying that languages like Cushitic languages and Egyptian and Bantu languages, Niger-Congo languages, Saharan languages all formed a unity. There were actually no linguistic grounds for that, but they just tried to push their ideology. And interestingly, they tried very hard to exclude Berber, even though that doesn't make any sense on linguistic grounds. Berber cannot be fully separated from Egyptian, Chadic, and Cushitic, but because Berbers are usually pretty light skins as compared to black Africans, yeah, there were scholars who were doing their best and were trying to push this agenda that Berbers don't belong to Africa, and all the other language families in Africa are forming a genetic unity. Of course, there were no linguistic grounds for that, and those are luckily also not considered mainstream today. So let's see how Afro-Asiatic is treated as a linguistic family today. Let's see some more info and some numbers, etc. So first of all, like I did in my video on Semitic languages, a short overview over the earliest written accounts. So the oldest attested Afro-Asiatic language, and maybe the oldest attested language on Earth, maybe second after Sumerian, is Egyptian. Egyptian was attested since, well, the earliest point was the 34th century BCE, even though back then the hieroglyphic writing system wasn't fully developed and there were no full text, so complete text with a fully developed writing system came a little later, maybe back in the 26th or something century BCE in the Old Kingdom. But the earliest written accounts, even if fragmentary, of Egyptian go back to the 34th century BCE. And since then, I mean, Egyptian is an extinct language today. Maybe the last actual speakers of Egyptian lived in the 17th, 18th, maybe 19th century, but it is still used in church liturgy until today in the Coptic Church of Egypt. So it is not only one of the two oldest languages attested, but it is also the oldest language still used today. Not spoken today, but used today. Liturgical use. So Egyptian. Second is a Semitic language, and I talked about Akkadian in my last video. But yeah, so second place is Semitic, represented by Akkadian since the 25th century BCE. Akkadian is completely extinct, so even as a classic language, it wasn't used longer than maybe the 2nd century CE. And then comes the third place, and there's a big gap between the second and third place, because third is Berber. And Berber is attested in the form of Numidian, which seems to be a Berber language, but there's a debate going on because Numidian isn't really understood very well and there's a lot of decipherment going on. But let's say Numidian is a Berber language. It was attested in its written form using the Tifinagh script since the 3rd century BCE until the 3rd century CE. Okay, so Berber is on place 3, and apart from that, there are no other Afro-Asiatic languages attested since antiquity. So Cushitic languages and Chadic languages achieved their written form much later. For example, Somali at some point was written in the Arabic alphabet, but that was in the, I think, 13th century or so, and Chadic languages like Hausa much later. Though there might be a lot of onomastic material, that is names, especially in Egyptian, because the Egyptians also mentioned Libyans in their texts and Libyan rulers, Libyan personal names, and the Libyans were certainly mostly Berber speaking. So a lot of the Libyan names mentioned in Egyptian texts may be actually onomastic material of Berber. And there may also be others, because, for example, the Egyptians were in contact with a Cushitic speaking people known as the Magi. And if you played the game Assassin's Creed Origins, you probably know that the protagonist, Bayek of Siwa, is a so-called Magi. Magi were a kind of desert police in Egypt, but they were originally recruited out of a people known as Magi. So this is a Nisba, it means people of Medja, and Medja was a region near the Red Sea in what is today Sudan, and the Magi are assumed to be ancestors of today's Beja people. Okay, so in hieroglyphic Egyptian texts they were known as Magi. Later they were known as Blemis, and in Greek texts, for example, today they are named Beja, but there's a consensus, I think, that those are the same people. So I could imagine there might be maybe some ancient Beja, that is Magi names, mentioned in Egyptian texts. Okay, so much for the earliest written accounts. So what about the speaker numbers today? Let me exclude Semitic because I did Semitic in the last video. So the largest in terms of speaker number non-Semitic Afro-Asiatic language is Hausa, a Chadic language with approximately, the numbers aren't really reliable, but maybe approximately 60 million speakers, plus some 30 million L2 speakers, so speakers who speak Hausa as a second language, because Hausa is a lingua franca in large parts of Central and Western Africa. And Hausa is also by far the largest Chadic language in terms of number of speakers, because the second largest, I forgot which one it is, but it has some 300,000 speakers, and many Chadic languages have less than a couple of thousand speakers. Maybe some have just a few hundred speakers. Okay, so Hausa is on the first position here. Second and three are two Cushitic languages, Oromo and Somali. Oromo with maybe 38 million speakers, Somali maybe 22 million. And then we have two Berber languages, Tashelhit 7 million and Taqbaylit 6 million. And that's basically the first 5 positions. So in total, if we include Semitic now, the total number of speakers of Afro-Asiatic languages, and I know the numbers vary very widely, so there's a lot of different opinions on how it is exactly, on how much is it exactly, but the total numbers might be 500 million or even more. So the numbers aren't really reliable, but it might be in this like in this class. Okay, so that is the speakers of all Afro-Asiatic languages today. And just to have one more look at a map, so this map is anachronistic, I might add, because everything except Egyptian is shown in its present-day borders, but Egyptian isn't spoken anymore today, so it couldn't be included in a map containing only the modern areas of those languages. I still included Egyptian just to show you where it was spoken and that it is part of this family. Yeah, so Egyptian was spoken back here in antiquity, and you see the big green area, Semitic, which is mostly Arabic. Here in yellow you see the Berber languages, brown is Chadic, turquoise is Cushitic, and there's a small purple spot here which is Omotic. Okay, and I will give you a list, more detailed, what these languages are. What are Berber languages, Cushitic languages, etc. So first of all, Semitic languages, yeah, I can simply refer you to my previous video because that was about Semitic languages. Next one is the Egyptian branch. I also named also added the name Kemek. You could call it like that. I would not call it Kemetic. For well, this is just my own opinion, but Kemetic is, let me use the pen. So Kemetic is named after the ancient Egyptian name for Egypt, which was well, KMT. So in conventional pronunciation in Egyptology you would call it Kemet, but it was probably never really pronounced Kemet. So the T is a feminine ending. The vocalization that we can reconstruct with some certainty is Kumat. And when I do my videos on Egyptian, I will give you a lot of details on how we can reconstruct the vocalism of not all but many Egyptian words. So at some point it was pronounced Kumat. At some point the T became silent, so it was Kuma or Kume. And then at some point during the late Egyptian era, the stressed U shifted to E, and that's why in Coptic we have Keme. Okay, let me write it in Coptic, in the Coptic alphabet. With my mouse it's a little, it doesn't look good, but Keme in Coptic. So the T is a feminine ending, and just my opinion, it doesn't belong in a name like Kemetic, because you see the root is KM, or actually KMM, and this is actually a verb meaning to be black. This verb is attested in Coptic as kmom, that's the infinitive, and the T is just an instrument to turn it into the name for the country, and it's a feminine ending. So we also have feminine endings, also T in Semitic languages, also forming the names of languages, for example, Arabic, al-Arabiyatu, Hebrew, Ivrith, Aramaic, Aramith, but we don't call them Arabitic or Hebritic or Aramitic, so also Kemetic, including the feminine ending, doesn't make much sense. So that's why I prefer Kemic over Kemetic. And there's actually one Coptic dialect which is called Meso-Kemic, okay, because it was spoken or is attested in the middle of the whole Coptic speaking area. And I mean, the other thing is Kemetic. If you look for Kemetic on YouTube or on social media, you will reach some really sometimes shady corner of YouTube, and people trying to teach you Kemetic, and then they talk about race and skin color for the rest of the video, and they will tell you that Kemetic is a Bantu language, etc., and a lot of non-linguistic stuff that simply isn't scientific. So forget about the Kemetic. So Egyptian or Kemic, I prefer Egyptian, to be honest, because in most of the literature you will find it under this term, so let's not make it more complicated than it is. Egyptian is often seen as one language, so one single language, forming this branch of Afro-Asiatic, but there's more to it. So there's one thing here I called Egyptian proper, which is the Egyptian language. It has different historical stages. Old Egyptian, so the language of the Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period. At some point it was replaced by another language, Middle Egyptian, which is just a slightly updated version of that language. You know, the language changed over time, and at some point it was just the written language was adapted to match the spoken language, so that was Middle Egyptian in the Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period in the first half of the New Kingdom. Then in the second half of the New Kingdom, in the Third Intermediate period, we have Late Egyptian, and then at some point in the late period we have Demotic, and then in the end we have Coptic, which is Egyptian written in Greek letters, and this was introduced in the times when Egypt was converted to Christianity. Okay, so those are 5 historical stages of Egyptian. But next to that there's more. There's something called Napatan, named after the city of Napata in which is today Sudan. So back then it was Nubia, or the Kingdom of Kush, and in that city we have written accounts of a form of Egyptian which differs a little. So there's one article, Das Napatanische, by Egyptologist Carsten Poist, which is written in German, so if you know German you can read it. He basically sees Napatan as an Egyptian dialect due to the differences between this and the normal Middle or Late Egyptian. Yeah, so it might be a dialect of Egyptian, maybe a language close to Egyptian, maybe some kind of mixed language. I'm not sure about this, but yeah, this might be one example for something included in this branch of Afro-Asiatic which isn't Egyptian proper. And then there's something simply called the language of the Hati'a. Those were people dwelling the western desert of Egypt, so not proper Egypt, which was the fertile land along the river Nile, but the desert and the desert oasis. And apart from Libyans, there also lived these people, Hati'a, and there are no actual written accounts of their language, but we have names of them mentioned in Egyptian texts, and they look very close to Egyptian, but with some phonological differences, it seems. So this might also have been a language that was close to Egyptian. And this concludes the Egyptian branch of the Afro-Asiatic languages. The next branch is Berber, or better Libyco-Berber. Libyco-Berber basically might be defined as consisting of 3 branches. The first one is actual Berber, and the other ones are Numidian and Guanche. So let's talk about Berber first. Berber, there's also other terms for that. One other term is Amazigh, which is what they call themselves. Amazigh, a Berber person. Amazirin is the plural, and the language is called Tamazight, and several of these dialects are all called Tamazight, so there's some kind of overlap in terminology. So some Berber-speaking people prefer the term Amazigh to refer to themselves rather than Berber. Others use Amazigh when they write something in their Tamazight language, and they use Berber when they write something when they publish something on these languages in English, French, etc. And there's also been the attempt to use the term Tamazight, but so far that wasn't successful. This language family can be divided into several branches. Some Berberologists divide them into 2 branches, some into 4. So let me use the 4-branch model here. One branch is Western Berber, represented by Zinaga, also known as Tuzungiya, which is spoken in a very small area in Mauritania at the Atlantic coast. Then there's the very diverse northern group, which consists of Tashelhit, Central Atlas Tamazight, these are spoken in Morocco. Then there's the Zenati group, Tarifit, Tashawit, and others, Taqbaylit, spoken in Algeria, and Radamsi. Then there is an eastern group, mostly spoken in Oasis in the Eastern Sahara. For example, Tasiwit, spoken in the Siwa Oasis in Egypt, and Tajwilit and others. And then there's the southern group, which is also known as Tuareg, or by its indigenous name Tamajiq, with variants like Tamahaq or Tamashaq. Okay, so these are basically the proper Amazigh, maybe I can call them, languages. Then there's also Numidian. I mentioned it before. It might have been a Berber language or something close to Berber, which is why some linguists came up with this larger Libyco-Berber language branch, which is extinct. So Numidian is extinct. And then there's also Guanche, which is also extinct. It was spoken on the Canary Islands, and it became extinct, I think, in the 17th or something century. And there's some records in Spanish which are quite obscure, a very crude way of transcribing them, so not exactly helpful. Maybe if the material was better, it would be easier to assess the internal classification or relationships of these languages, especially Numidian and Guanche. So just a map of the Tamazight languages, or Berber languages. So this big blob here in the Sahara, covering parts of Algeria, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, is Tamajiq, also known as Tuareg. Here we have Tuzungiya, the coast, Mauritania. Up here, these are mostly the northern Berber languages, like Tamazight and Tashelhit, Tarifit, etc. And here we have the Eastern Berber languages like Tajwilit and Tasiwit, the only ones spoken in Egypt, close to the Libyan border, but it is in Egypt. So the next branch are the Chadic languages, and probably the most well-known one is Hausa. Sorry for the other languages, but Hausa is well known, whereas the others, some of you may have never heard about any of them. This is due to the fact that Hausa is just spoken by so many more people than the others and has become a lingua franca and also a a literary language of Islamic studies in Western Africa. So still, Chadic is divided mostly into 4 branches: West, Central, also known as Biumandara, East, and Massa. And actually, many of these names you see here are not individual languages, but language groups that are further divided and then subdivided, etc. So Chadic is quite complex. There's a lot of different Chadic languages. So if we look at a map, a less detailed map, it looks like this. So here's the Lake Chad, and they are situated here. We can look at it in more detail. So in more detail, it looks like this. Here is West Chadic, and actually most of West Chadic is Hausa. So I think the border is somewhere here. And so the rest of this, I just mark it in red. So this big blob is basically Hausa, and the rest of it is lots and lots and lots of small languages. Maybe many of them are the size of these small enclaves here. Okay, so the 4 languages of Chadic. The next branch of Afro-Asiatic is Cushitic. Cushitic is mostly spoken on the Horn of Africa. It is usually divided into 4 branches. The unity of this Cushitic language branch is also disputed. I will talk about the internal classification of Afro-Asiatic later, but mostly Cushitic, if seen as a branch of Afro-Asiatic, is divided into 4 branches. The first one is North Cushitic, which consists of a single language called Beja, also known as Bedawi, spoken on the Red Sea coast of southern Egypt, Sudan, and Eritrea. Then we have Central Cushitic, also known as Ago, and Ago is sometimes further divided into 4 different dialects, but seen as one Ago language. So the dialects are Aungi, Bilen, Khamtanga, and Kimand. I think Kimand is mostly spoken by Beta Israel, Jewish Ethiopians who now mostly live in Israel, and Bilen is spoken in Eritrea, and Aungi and Khamtanga are spoken in Ethiopia, surrounded by the Amharic-speaking area. And then there's also East and South Cushitic, at which we will look in more detail. So East Cushitic, in turn, is divided into Highland East and Lowland East Cushitic. Highland East, spoken in a very small area, comparably in the Ethiopian highlands. Maybe the most well-known one might be Sidamo, also because the Sidama people have got their own province in Ethiopia a couple of years ago. Before that, they were part of the southern nationalities and nations region, but now they have their own Sidama province. Then Lowland East Cushitic, we have the Saho Afar group, Afar spoken in Ethiopia, in the Danakil region, and Saho in Eritrea mostly. Then we have the Oromoid group, containing Oromo. Oromo also is not always seen as a single language, but as a group of languages, covering a very large area in Ethiopia and also parts of Kenya, for example. Oromo is also the most frequently spoken, so the language with the highest number of speakers in Ethiopia, mostly in the state of Oromia. And then we have the Arboroid group of Lowland East. We have the Somaloid branch, which contains the Somali languages. These are probably the best known example of Somaloid languages. And then we have also smaller groups like Dullai and Bon. And apart from East Cushitic, we also have South Cushitic, which consists of basically 3 groups, Burungi, Alagwa, and Iraquoid. And Iraquoid consists of 2 languages, Iraq and Gorwa. All of these, I think, are spoken in Tanzania. If we look at this at a map, so this darker area is Beja or North Cushitic. Then we have 3 bright spots here, Bilen, Khamtang, and Aungi, so the Agau or Central Cushitic languages. Then there's something in blue here, Sidamic or Highland East Cushitic. And everything in this turquoise color is Lowland East Cushitic, so quite a vast area. Saho, Afar, Somali, Oromo, Dullai, Arbore, Dasanaj, and many others, Dahalo as well. And with quite some distance from the other Cushitic languages down here, we have the South Cushitic languages, for example, Iraq. Okay, so that's what it looks like on a map. Finally, one other branch of Afroasiatic that wasn't mentioned before. At least it wasn't mentioned in the Greenberg family tree of Afroasiatic, because he saw it as a branch of Cushitic. But it is now mostly seen as a separate Afroasiatic branch. This purple area here is the Omotic languages. You see it's surrounded by different Cushitic languages. Also Semitic languages are spoken nearby. And the white areas are, of course, non-Afroasiatic languages, like, for example, Nilo-Saharan languages. And yeah, so Oromo is divided into a north and south branch. And again, I don't know if you have heard about any of them, but for example, Wolaita might be a little more well known, because, for example, it was the native language of the I think the previous prime minister of Ethiopia, Haile Mariam Desalegn, I think his name was. He was Wolaita. There are a few cases of languages that might be Afroasiatic, but it's disputed. One of those cases is a language called Ongota or Birale. You can see it there in the middle. It's this red dot on the map. It is a moribund language. It is spoken by just a few people, maybe not even 20 people in, I don't know if it's one village or a number of villages, but it's moribund. It's on the verge of extinction, and most of those Ongota people are switching to other Cushitic languages that are spoken in the area. So it is almost extinct, and this language has features of both Afroasiatic and Nilo-Saharan, which created some controversy on how to classify it. So some linguists classify it as a separate branch of Afroasiatic. So next to Semitic and Cushitic and Egyptian, etc., is also Ongota as a single branch. Some say it's even a Cushitic language. Some say it's a distinct branch of Cushitic. Some say it's even part of East Cushitic, just maybe with some significant Nilo-Saharan adstrate, so through language contact. Some say it's the other way around. It's a Nilo-Saharan language with Cushitic traces of contact. Some say it's even some kind of Creole, so just a mixed language, a mixed Nilo-Saharan and Cushitic language. And there's been also other linguists who say that it is an isolate, so a unique isolated language which is influenced by Cushitic on the one hand and Nilo-Saharan on the other hand. Considering it's moribund, it'll probably be difficult to assess this question in the future when the last speakers die or switch to other languages. One case similar to this is the Kujargi language. This is also disputed. So the Kujargi language is spoken, also a small red dot, in this area in Chad at the border of Sudan. And Kujargi, interestingly, has features of both Cushitic and Chadic. So Chadic, just based on geography, isn't really surprising, because it is spoken in proximity to Eastern Chadic languages. On the other side, we have Sudanese Arabic. Cushitic geographically is a little further away. But yeah, what have been the classification proposals? So there have been proposals that it is a separate branch of Afroasiatic with considerable Chadic influence and also maybe genetic similarity to Cushitic. Some say it's simply an East Chadic language, which for some reason has some Cushitic features. And again, others say it is a language isolate with both Chadic and Cushitic influence. The question is, how did it get influenced by these two branches? Maybe in the distant past, the areas of Chadic and Cushitic were larger and met at some point. Who knows? But this is one disputed case. And there's a third disputed case, which is Meroitic. So Meroitic was written and spoken in the city of Meroe in the kingdom of Kush, so Nubia, today Sudan. And the texts are attested in the 3rd or maybe 4th century BCE until the 4th century CE. And you can see one example picture here. This is Meroitic cursive writing. There are also Meroitic hieroglyphs. And it is still unclassified, so most linguists who deal with Meroitic tend to classify it as a Nubian language, which is part of the Nilo-Saharan language family, related to what is also called Old Nubian, which was written much later, and related to modern Nobin, which is spoken along the Nile in southern Egypt and northern Sudan. But there have also been proposals to classify it as Afro-Asiatic based on certain consonant patterns that appear. Yeah, it is not really understood as to now, so this is still disputed, but I think the majority of linguists dealing with Meroitic classify it as a Nubian language of the Nilo-Saharan language family, so probably not Afro-Asiatic. Now we can look at some features. Again, I will just pick some features that are remarkable and not go too much into detail maybe, but as in the last video on Semitic languages, I want to point out the so-called emphatic consonants. So emphatic consonants, if you missed my last video, you can rewatch it, but there's two manners of pronouncing them, either pharyngealized or as ejectives. So again, two examples from Semitic, namely Arabic and Ge'ez. In Arabic, we have these emphatic consonants. They are s, d, th, th, and q. They are all pharyngealized. Whereas Ge'ez, which is also a Semitic languages, pronounces these as ejectives. That means t, 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 k, and p. P, though, is borrowed, and it is often used to represent the letter P in Greek borrowings, for example, the word papas. Okay, but nevertheless, it is an emphatic consonant. Now, we do have them in all other branches of Afro-Asiatic as well, and both manners of pronunciation exist. So, for example, in Berber languages, they're here represented by Tamaziq. We have, for example, z and d, and these are actually the only emphatic consonants that are reconstructed for Proto-Berber, z and d. There is also t in many Berber languages, but it is usually the product of doubling of d. And you see, even the writing signs are almost identical. So d, and geminated, it will become a t. Then we also have q, which is historically probably not a real emphatic because it is a geminated allophone of r. Nevertheless, the way it is pronounced, it can be counted as an emphatic consonant, q. And then we have s, which, as far as I know, only occurs in borrowings from Arabic. So the Tamaziq emphatic consonants are z, d, t, q, and s. They're all pronounced pharyngealized. Ancient Egyptian. Even though the transliteration of Ancient Egyptian doesn't really show it, but Egyptian is also assumed to have had emphatic consonants, and even the oldest Egyptian grammars, even the Ägyptische Grammatik published by Adolphe Ermont in 1902 says something like, so despite this hand hieroglyph being transliterated with a D, we know pretty safely that this was an emphatic T. So in Egyptian, this hand hieroglyph was probably pronounced T. Okay, not D, but T. Then this is basically the palatalized version, T and K. Okay, so these three hieroglyphic signs can quite safely be assumed to have been emphatic. So Egyptian has T, K, and K. Okay, so much for Egyptian. Then we have Hausa. Hausa does not only have ejectives but also implosives, which is a similar mechanism but sounds a little different. So in Hausa we have t, d, k, q, b, and the last one, I understand the IPA symbol. It is a creaky voiced approximant. It should be something like yeah. Okay, it sounds weird, and I think this sound is also pretty rare in Hausa. So the most frequent ones are t, d, k, q, and b. And now also two examples from Cushitic. We have Oromo, t, d, ch, k, and b. And in Iraq, and this sound is also in the name of the language, we have t, t, k, and q. And just keep note that these aren't just emphatic Ks, but these are uvular consonants. So like in Arabic qaf, but as an ejective, q. And the other one is q. Okay, t, t, k, q. So, and these do not occur in every single Afro-Asiatic language, not even in every Semitic language, but they do occur in each branch of Afro-Asiatic and are a pretty defining phonological feature of Afro-Asiatic languages. So as for some morphology, I gave you a chart here of personal pronouns in Proto-Semitic, Egyptian, Proto-Berber, Hausa, and Oromo. Let me just do this briefly and point out some things that that might catch the eye. So if we look at the word for I, Anaku, Yanak, and Enak, and the suffix na in Hausa, or well, actually the others too, ni, ni, na, and Oromo an. You see some common elements, so there's always a vowel and an n. Well, in Hausa the first vowel is dropped, but the n is retained, and in Semitic, Egyptian, and Berber we also have a k, so there's quite some similarity. Or let's look at some of the pronouns, also the suffixes for the second person. Like in Semitic we have ka, in Egyptian we have a suffix k. In Berber we have ik, and also this kai pronoun. In Hausa we have kai and nka and ka. And the feminine version ki, t or ti, and again something with k, and here some pronouns with k. And Oromo, well, C might just be a sparentized version because cross-linguistically it's quite common for a K to turn into an S. Look at Latin, Cicero, and in French you call him Cicero. Okay, and if you study this chart and take some time and study the details, you will see a lot of similarities. For example, here we have Su'a, Suwat, Suwa, Is, and here we have S sounds, Shin, Sa, Sha, Isa, and there's a lot of patterns that reoccur. Of course, the Egyptian pronunciation is reconstructed. You probably know that. So just a few information. As for the Egyptian, if you know Egyptian, the C, what I wrote C here in the normal transliteration is the underlined T, so the palatal sound ch. Okay. Yeah. Here we have S sounds, so you always have sounds that occur in the pronouns of all branches of Afro-Asiatic. Of course, there's many more languages. Some of the languages quoted here, like Hausa and Oromo, even have more forms of the pronoun. So in Oromo, I only quoted the, I think it's the absolute form. In Hausa, I quoted the subject and object form. And the I think the third one is the possessive. And so there's many more forms and of course many more languages. Just want to point your direction at some things that we can point out that are similar between all of these languages. Okay, so these are simply the singular pronouns. Let's look at the plural forms. So plural forms, also many reoccurring elements. So for we, first person plural, we have this n here in nihnu and the suffix ni or na. In Egyptian we have these n suffixes or n forms, also in the Berber suffix. In Oromo it's nu, and in Hausa, where there's another nasal sound, nevertheless a nasal sound in these mu suffixes. And yeah, let's look at the second person plural. In Semitic the suffix is kum. In Egyptian we have tun, and in Proto-Berber we have kawani, and in Hausa we have ku. And in Oromo we have isin, again probably with some kind of palatalization. So also if you study these nouns, you will stumble upon many similarities. The only problem with Afro-Asiatic is that it is quite difficult to to categorize them or to even reconstruct Proto-Afro-Asiatic forms of these pronouns. So yeah, I will talk later about the difficulties in reconstructing Proto Afro-Asiatic, but it has to do with the massive time frame. Okay, and now just some more randomly picked features of morphology that I want to show you. So one thing that we find in all branches of Afro-Asiatic is that they have two genders, and the feminine is usually marked with a T. So first of all, Semitic languages, Akkadian, and here we have the Akkadian words for king and queen, Sarum and Sarratum, and the queen is marked with a T, Sarratum. That makes the difference between queen and king. In Egyptian, again here, you see the words for god and goddess, and whether the conventional pronunciation in Egyptological discussions is Netcher and Netcheret. And of course you will find videos on YouTube trying to teach you Medu Neter. But here I've also given you the reconstructed pronunciation of these words, and I will talk about this reconstruction in detail when I do videos on Egyptian. But just to show you what this was pronounced like, so God was Natyal and goddess was Natyalet, and in hieroglyphic writing as well as in the actual pronunciation we see this T as the feminine element. In Coptic this became silent, that's why in Coptic we have Nute and Tore. Nute and Tore. But in Middle Egyptian, maybe the pronunciation I reconstructed, it might be for Middle Egyptian, maybe Old Egyptian, because I think the T already became silent in Middle Egyptian. So yeah, Natyal and Natyalet. You see the R hieroglyph was also probably pronounced as an L rather than an R, at least until the Middle Egyptian period. So Natyal, Natyalet. One more example from Berber, represented by Tamajaq, little brother and little sister. So little brother is Amidrai and little sister Tamidrait. Sorry. This is just normalities. And the interesting thing about Berber is that they often use a T circumfix. So one T at the beginning of the word and another one at the end to mark the feminine. Amidrai and Tamidrait. And then in the end, one Cushitic language, just to give you one more example, Bedja, Tak, man, and Takat, woman. Okay, Tak and Takat. Okay. One other feature also from morphology, but verbal morphology, that I find interesting is causative verbs with S. So causative means you cause somebody to do something, you make somebody do something. So for example, in Akkadian we have eribum. Eribum means to enter, and surubum means to make somebody enter or to let somebody enter. So in Akkadian we have this sibilant marking the the causative, and this is done with many different verbs. And this is also done in many other Semitic languages, though in some languages, actually in a lot of Semitic languages, this S was weakened to a guttural sound. For example, in Hebrew, it is represented by he. So in Hebrew you have hif'il, for example, the causative verb. And in other languages like Arabic, also Aramaic, and Gi'iz or other Ethiopic languages, this has become a glottal stop. So that's, for example, in Arabic you have fa'ala and af'ala, and in Aramaic you have pa'al and af'al. Okay, but the more conservative ones, phonologically conservative, like Akkadian, have this sibilant, surubum, and we have the same thing in Egyptian. Only in Egyptian it is not done with many verbs, it is quite restricted. So in Egyptian we have this word, which is conventionally pronounced ankh by some Egyptologists, or if they're Arabic speakers, sometimes they say ankh, though the reconstructed pronunciation was probably more like aanr. This can be used as a noun, life, but also as a verb, to live. Okay, aanr, to live. And there is a causative form, so an S is added, and then it means to give life, to let live, also to nourish, something like that. And it was probably pronounced sa'ni, sa'ni. And there's a palatalized sound at the end. You can see that in Coptic. This is the same two words in Sahidic Coptic, one and sa'nish. So here this original, it is transcribed as an H with a bow below, like the symbol for Arabic kha, but it was probably voiced in Egyptian, anr and sa'ni. And so in Coptic, the one became ha, and the other one became sh. Unah and sa'nish. One more example from Tamaziq. Two verbs, atkar and satkar. So atkar is to fill, to become full, and satkar, also with the s, means to fill something, to make somebody full, to cause, to make something full, to cause something to be full. Atkar and satkar. And one example from Beja, or Beja, I think it's actually pronounced Beja. Agriya and agrisiya. Agriya is he learned, and agrisiya is he caused somebody to learn, he taught somebody. I hope I quoted these right. I don't know Beja, but I found these examples in the grammar and just quoted them. So agriya and agrisiya. So these are causatives. You see in Semitic, Egyptian, and Tamaziq, these are prefixes, whereas in Beja, this is put at the end of the verbal root, so it is a suffix. And as for numerals, Proto-Semitic, Egyptian, Proto-Berber, and Beja numerals. So we have the masculine forms here and the feminine forms with a T added. There are some similarities. So if we look at number 2 in Proto-Semitic, Egyptian, and Proto-Berber, the root of this in Proto-Semitic is thin. In Egyptian it's sin, and in Berber it's sin or sin. In Beja it's completely different, malob and malot. There's no similarity, but at least in Semitic, Egyptian, and Berber these agree. If we look at the other numbers, I don't see many similarities except for maybe the 5 in Semitic, Khamis, and in Berber, Samus. There's a difference, but the other ones you see, if you know Semitic, for example, like I did, I started with Semitic and then later I learned Egyptian. Looking at this and expecting more similarities, this is quite frustrating, because numerals are some of the most basic lexical items that you use to compare things. And you saw in my last video in Semitic this works pretty well, but you see in Afroasiatic this does not work that well. Okay, let me still read them to you. I will just read maybe just the masculine forms. So in Proto-Semitic I've also had this in the last video, but it's astum, thinana, shalathum, arba'um, khamisum. In Egyptian the masculine forms are wi', sinu, yamteu, yiftau, tiyo. In Proto-Berber, Yiwan or Yiwan, Sin or Hissin, Karad, Hakuz, and Samus. And Beja, this is the only one in this chart that is still spoken today. I hope I don't butcher the accent too much, but it's Gal, Malob, Mahai, Fardig, and Ai. Okay, and you see the Beja numbers. I don't see any similarity with the other ones. Let's look at the numbers 6 to 10. So 6 to 10, let's just try to point out some similarities. So Sith and Sadis, I think they're quite similar. Seis might be also related to them. Then we have Saba and Safi maybe, and Sa maybe with a big question mark. For number 8, Thamani and Yamano are very similar, I think. Tam might be related. And then for 9, we have Tissa in Semitic and Tizza in Berber might be related. Pesitio is probably not related to them. And then for 10, we have Ashar and Mucho and Marau. I don't think there's any correlation. And Beja again is completely different from the other ones. And if I had one example from Chadic now, I think in Chadic there's one number that is similar to the Egyptian one, and then also that's it. So there's not much more. Okay, let me still maybe just to lift the frustration, read them to you. So Semitic, again only the masculine forms. Sithum, Sab'um, Thamaniyum, Tis'um, Asharum. Egyptian, Seisau, Safio, Yamano, Pesitio, Mutio. Of course, these are reconstructed, mostly on the basis of Coptic. Berber, Proto-Berber, Sadis, Sah or Hissah, Tam or Hittam, Tizah or Tizzah, and Marau. And then Beja. Again, this is a spoken language today, so I hope I don't mess up the accent too much, but Asagwir, Asaramab, Asumhai, Ashadig, Tamin. Okay, I will not go over any more lexical features, but you can imagine how frustrating that would be, because lexically there's the similarities between the different branches of Afroasiatic are quite scarce. So some more details on the internal classification. Of course, there have been different attempts to classify Afroasiatic internally, and they differ quite much because there's so, in some areas of the languages, there's so little similarities. So you've seen this before by Greenberg. I just added something. Greenberg also subdivides Cushitic into North Cushitic, which is Beja, Central Cushitic, which is Ago, East Cushitic, then West Cushitic, which we today call Omotic and don't usually count as part of Cushitic, and South Cushitic. On a map, it would look like this. So this is basically the map I showed you before. Only on this map, Omotic is also counted as Cushitic. And of course, again, this map is anachronistic. There's Egyptian, but the other languages are shown in today's borders. So in the 1980s, Paul Newman came up with a different classification. He classified Afroasiatic into 3 sub-branches: Berbero-Chadic, Egypto-Semitic, and Cushitic, because he apparently just found many similarities between Berber and Chadic on the one hand, and Egyptian and Semitic on the other hand. And this is basically what it would look like as a map. I think I'm not quite sure right now, but I think he also saw Omotic as being a Cushitic language. So Fleming, 1980s onward, his classification is a little more complex. So first of all, there's a top layer where Afroasiatic is divided into Omotic and Erythraean. So Omotic on the one hand and everything else on the other hand, because Omotic seems just like just so divergent from all of the other Afroasiatic languages. Then Erythraean in turn is divided into Cushitic, Ongota, and non-Ethiopian, and then non-Ethiopian is everything else. There's one difference to most other classification attempts, namely that Beja is not considered Cushitic, but here Beja is in the non-Ethiopian group together with Chadic, Berber, Egyptian, and Semitic. So this is what it would look like on a map, that at least the top layer of classification, Omotic on one hand and Erythraean on the other hand. And then the second layer, so the Erythraean languages would be Cushitic and non-Ethiopian, non-Ethiopian also containing Beja. Then there has been another attempt by Christopher Ehret. He divides Afroasiatic into Omotic and Erythraean as well. Also adds that Omotic is divided into North Omotic and South Omotic. Then Erythraean is divided into Cushitic and North Erythraean. Cushitic is divided into Beja, Ago, and East-South Cushitic, which is East and South Cushitic apparently. And North Erythraean is divided into Chadic and Boro-Afrasian, so like North Afrasian. And Boro-Afrasian in turn is divided into Egyptian, Semitic, and Berber. I didn't make a map on this because it is quite complex and has a lot of different layers of subclassification. One other classification attempt that I found interesting was published by Orel and Stolbova, which divides Afroasiatic in actually 8 different branches. First one is Berbero-Semitic, which means Berber and Semitic. Second one is Egypto-Chadic, consisting of Chadic and Egyptian, and then there are 6 separate branches: Omotic, Ago, Lone and East Cushitic, Beja, Sidamic, Rift. So Cushitic is not seen as one branch of Afroasiatic here, more like different branches that are in contact and form some kind of Sprachbund, so an area of areal diffusion of language features. Yeah, but that's what this classification looks like. And this is what it looks like on a map. So we have Berbero-Semitic, we have Egypto-Chadic, and then we have Beja, Ago-Sidamic, Omotic, Lowland East Cushitic, and Rift. One other classification attempt was made by Diakonov. So he's got Afrasian. He uses Afrasian instead of Afro-Asiatic, and he simply divides it into East-West and North-South. East-West is Berber-Cushitic and Semitic, and North-South is Egyptian and Chadic. I think he classified those two, Egyptian and Chadic, together because of their verbal system, because they only use suffixes to modify verbs, whereas the others, Berber-Cushitic and Semitic, also use prefixes. And I think he excluded Omotic entirely. So this is Diakonov's classification on a map. A large area that is East-West Afrasian, and two smaller areas that are North-South Afrasian. And I don't know if it was his article or another one, but somebody assumed that the original homeland of both Egyptian and Chadic, if they were one language once, was somewhere at the Upper Nile, so somewhere very further down south. Then the Egyptians moved north and the Chadic speakers moved west. One other classification by Lionel Bender, Afro-Asiatic, divided into Omotic, Chadic, and Macro-Cushitic. And Macro-Cushitic consisting of Berber, Cushitic, and Semitic. I think he didn't bother about Egyptian, and I think this is the only classification where Semitic and Cushitic are put in the same group, but not in the same group with Chadic, and Cushitic not in the same group with Omotic. So yeah, this is an interesting twist. And one last classification here, Afrasian, classified by Militarev, mostly based on lexicostatistics, I think. So Afrasian, in his classification, is divided into South Afrasian, which is Omotic and Cushitic, and North Afrasian is divided into Semitic and African North Afrasian, which in turn is divided into Egyptian and Chado-Berber, and Chado-Berber apparently is divided into Chadic and Berber. So with all these classification attempts, let me close this video with some remarks on Proto-Afro-Asiatic. So yeah, I can talk about Proto-Afro-Asiatic and its Urheimat. The problem with Proto-Afro-Asiatic is it is very difficult to reconstruct Proto-Afro-Asiatic if it ever existed at all. It is still highly hypothetical. So I've got this book here, Reconstructing Proto-Afro-Asiatic, Proto-Afrasian, by Christopher Ehret, published in, I think, 1995. And he has very extensive lists of items there, but these lists are also full of gaps, and there are not many items that cover all, that have cognates in all branches of Afro-Asiatic. And Afro-Asiatic also has a very massive time frame. So Proto-Afro-Asiatic is assumed to have been existed as a language maybe 10,000 years BCE or even earlier. If we compare it to Proto-Indo-European, which is a quite solid reconstruction, still not without controversy, that one was spoken maybe 2500 BCE, so it is not nearly as old as Afro-Asiatic is supposed to be. So this is where we reach the areas of macro families, and this is also why some linguists say Afro-Asiatic is a macro family, and it's probably not more credible than Altaic, which hasn't been seen as a language family for quite a while. And yeah, as I said, there's often large gaps in the reconstructed paradigms, whether it is Proto-Afro-Asiatic numbers, pronouns, etc. And I have examples for you. So this is one example for a seemingly successful reconstruction of a paradigm, and you can find this in the aforementioned book by Christopher Ehret, though in this book it is not arranged as a chart like this, but all of these items are listed separately in a very long list of different items, so I just had to look them up in this list. Luckily on Wikipedia there was already a chart like this, so I just used the book to verify if everything is correct in this chart. Yeah, Christopher Ehret attempted to reconstruct Proto-Afro-Asiatic personal pronouns. He divided them into singular enclitic and singular independent for the first and second person singular. So first person singular enclitic is I or yi, second masculine is ku or ka, second feminine is ki. If you know any Semitic language, they will immediately be familiar to you, but you can also find these in ancient Egyptian, you can find these in different Chadic and Cushitic languages. So yeah, it makes sense. And then for the singular independent forms for the first person, he reconstructs, and these diacritics on the vowels are tonal markings, because he suggests that Proto-Afro-Asiatic was a tonal language. And tonal languages, we still find tonal languages in Cushitic, Omotic, and Chadic. We don't find any tone in Semitic, Berber, and Egyptian, but he assumes that it was Proto-Afro-Asiatic. So for I, he has an or in, and for you, masculine and feminine, probably no difference, he has ant and int. Okay, and then we have singular pronouns, enclitic and independent for the third person, si and isi. And plural, you see a rising tone, so we and us, our, etc. will be an or in. Second person plural, kuna, and third person plural, su or usu. Okay, and this is I think the only complete paradigm that I could find in this book, or extrapolate from this book, that makes sense. As for numerals and verbal endings, etc., there's no real complete paradigms that seem to be reconstructible in Proto-Afro-Asiatic. So just some remarks on the Urheimat, or the ancestral homeland. Just like with Semitic, there's different proposals. So from the Levant to the Horn of Africa, including the Red Sea coast or the Omo Valley in Ethiopia, and also the Sahara, there's been different proposals, sometimes trying to link Proto-Afro-Asiatic with different archaeological cultures. For example, the Levant theory tries to link Proto-Afro-Asiatic speakers to the Natufian archaeological culture, and yeah, some of these are based on different ideas, even on mathematical models. So yeah, but these are the different attempts on the ancestral homeland that you will find when you research this topic. And the time frame is just crazy. So I said 10,000 BCE before, though there's linguists who say Proto-Afro-Asiatic was spoken maybe 7,500 BCE. Others dated much further back to 16,000 BCE, which is really, and there we are in the area of macro languages like Nostratic maybe. Yeah, you see how little agreement, or how large the variation between these different theories is. So Afro-Asiatic is really something that is hard to pinpoint, to define, to reconstruct, to put in a clearly defined time frame or a geographical setting. So yeah, that's Afro-Asiatic to you. Now, in my video on Semitic languages, I had a reconstructed Proto-Semitic text at the end that I read to you. Something like this simply isn't possible in Proto-Afro-Asiatic. At least I cannot do it. Also not using this book by Christopher Ehret, and I would find it doubtful if anybody would show me a reconstructed Proto-Afro-Asiatic text. I would hardly doubt the credibility of this. So no reconstructed proto-text for you today, but don't be sad, because there will be lots of readings for you in my future videos. So this concludes today's video, and this also concludes my introduction to this channel, because the next videos will be what you're used to. So I will treat individual Semitic languages in my future videos. I will not only read this time, but I will also introduce the languages. So, for example, my next video, what I'm planning, I haven't started working on it yet, so you need to be a little patient. And right now, I'm also near the end of my current semester. I've got a lot of things to do for university. But I will start working on this at one point. But what I've planned for the next video is a general introduction to East Semitic. So I will talk about Akkadian and Eblaite, and then I will also explain the pronunciation of Akkadian in detail, and then I will read a number of Akkadian texts to you. So you can follow my reading and maybe try to reattempt it and read the translation, etc. I will also try to read something in Eblaite, but I cannot guarantee that because Eblaite, as some of you might know, is a little obscure. Okay, fine. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Concerning my next video, just be patient. It'll come at some point, and then you will hear some Akkadian, hopefully. See you soon.